Ethan Collins had spent years building his empire, surrounding himself with power, wealth, and absolute control. His life was carefully structured, every decision calculated. Nothing ever surprised him. Until the night his doorbell rang. When he opened the door, he expected a business associate, a security issue, maybe even an unwelcome journalist. Instead, he found her, Claire Watson, the woman he had walked away from years ago. And in her arms, clutching a small toy car with striking blue eyes that mirrored his own, stood a 6-year-old boy. "We need to talk," Claire said. And just like that, Ethan's world changed forever. Ethan Collins sat alone in his grand mansion, the silence pressing in on him like an invisible weight. The house was massive, a symbol of everything he had built: power, wealth, and control. Every detail was designed for efficiency, for luxury, for a man who needed no one. And yet, for all its grandeur, the house felt empty. He had spent years constructing the perfect life. His company was one of the most successful in the country, his financial empire unmatched. People respected him, feared him, envied him. But no one truly knew him. That was how he preferred it. He poured himself a glass of whiskey, the amber liquid catching the dim glow of the chandelier above. The quiet should have been comforting, a reward for his hard work. But tonight, something felt different. Then the doorbell rang. Ethan frowned, glancing at the time. No one ever came to his house unannounced. His security ensured that. If someone had made it to his front door, it was either a mistake, or something serious. Setting down his glass, he rose from his chair and walked to the door, his step steady, controlled. He didn't rush. He never did. When he opened it, his breath caught for the first time in years. Standing there was Claire Watson. The woman he had once loved, the woman he had walked away from when his career had demanded all of him. Her dark brown hair was slightly windblown, her brown eyes holding something unreadable. But it wasn't just her presence that shocked him. In her arms was a small boy, no older than 6. Ethan's sharp blue eyes immediately locked onto the child. Dark brown hair, thick and slightly messy, but the eyes, those piercing blue eyes, were his. His heart pounded, but his face remained expressionless, a skill he had mastered long ago. Claire didn't move, didn't say anything right away. She just stood there, holding the child close, as if bracing for impact. Finally, she spoke. Her voice was steady but carried a weight that told him this wasn't a casual visit. "We need to talk." Ethan's grip on the door tightened. He didn't know what she was about to say, but he knew, deep in his gut, that his life was about to change forever. Ethan stepped aside, allowing Claire and the boy to enter. His mind was racing, but his expression remained unreadable. Years of business negotiations had trained him to mask his emotions, to never let anyone see what he was truly thinking. But this was different. Claire walked in cautiously, holding the boy's hand tightly as if afraid he might disappear. The child clung to her, his small fingers wrapped around hers. He was quiet, but his blue eyes darted around the massive foyer, taking in the towering ceilings, the marble floors, and the grand staircase that spiraled upward. Ethan shut the door behind them, taking a deep breath before turning to face Claire. "Explain," he said, his voice firm but not unkind. Claire inhaled deeply, glancing down at the boy before meeting Ethan's gaze. "His name is Lucas," she said. "He's your son." The words landed like a blow to the chest. Ethan's grip on control faltered, just for a second. His gaze flickered to the boy, who was now staring up at him with those unmistakable blue eyes, his eyes. He felt the air shift around him, the foundation of everything he thought he knew suddenly unstable. "You're lying," he said, but even as the words left his mouth, he knew they weren't true. Claire lifted her chin, her expression unwavering. "I wouldn't be here if I was." Ethan ran a hand through his blonde hair, exhaling sharply. "Why now?" Claire hesitated. She looked down at Lucas, as if choosing her next words carefully. Because I don't have much time left, she finally admitted. Ethan narrowed his eyes. What are you talking about? She swallowed hard, her fingers tightening around Lucas's. I have cancer, she said. It's aggressive. The doctors say I have months, maybe less. For the first time in years, Ethan felt truly unprepared. The room suddenly felt too big, too cold. He had expected anything, an old debt, a desperate plea for money, even revenge for how he had walked away from her all those years ago. But this? His eyes flickered to Lucas again. The boy had no idea what was really happening. He was watching them both, trying to read their expressions, trying to understand why his mother's voice had changed. Ethan forced himself to focus. And what do you expect from me? Claire straightened, meeting his gaze head-on. I need you to take him. Ethan stiffened. What? I need you to raise him, she said. He has no one else. My sister refused. My parents are gone. When I'm gone, he'll have no one. Ethan shook his head, 1,000 arguments forming in his mind. I don't know how to be a father. Claire let out a breath, a bitter smile crossing her lips. Neither did I. But I learned. And so will you. Silence stretched between them. Ethan looked at Lucas again. The boy hadn't spoken a word. He just held his toy car tightly in his hands, standing there, waiting. Ethan wasn't sure if he was waiting for his decision, or if, deep down, he already knew what it would be. Ethan felt like the ground beneath him had shifted. He had faced boardroom battles, ruthless competitors, and high-stakes negotiations worth billions. Yet, standing in his own home, faced with a 6-year-old boy he had never met and a woman telling him he was a father, he had never felt so unprepared in his life. Claire stood firm, her expression determined but laced with exhaustion. She had always been strong-willed, but now there was something else in her eyes, urgency, desperation. She wasn't here to negotiate. She was here because she had no other choice. You can't expect me to suddenly become a father overnight, Ethan said, his voice steady despite the chaos inside his mind. Claire let out a slow breath. I don't expect miracles, Ethan. But Lucas needs someone. And whether you like it or not, that someone has to be you. Ethan turned his gaze to the boy. Lucas hadn't moved. He was holding his small toy car so tightly that his knuckles were turning white. His dark brown hair was slightly messy, falling into his striking blue eyes, eyes that mirrored Ethan's so perfectly it was impossible to deny the truth. Does he know? Ethan asked, keeping his voice low. Claire hesitated, glancing down at her son before answering. No. He knows his father was someone important, but I never told him it was you. Ethan clenched his jaw. Why? She met his gaze without flinching. Because I wasn't sure you'd want him. And I didn't want him growing up feeling unwanted. Something in Ethan's chest tightened. He had spent years building a life where emotions were a weakness, where attachments were liabilities. But now, looking at the small boy in front of him, hearing Claire's words, he realized the damage his choices had already caused. Lucas, Claire said gently, kneeling beside her son. Sweetheart, remember how we talked about your daddy? Lucas nodded slowly, his small fingers still gripping his toy car. Claire glanced up at Ethan, and for the first time that night, he saw the slightest hesitation in her expression. She was scared. Not of him, but of what this moment meant. She turned back to Lucas and took a steadying breath. This is him. This is your daddy. Silence. Lucas's blue eyes widened slightly as he looked up at Ethan again, this time with new understanding. He didn't speak. He didn't cry. He just stared. Ethan felt something heavy settle inside him. He had spent years keeping his life in order, maintaining control over everything. Yet, in this moment, he had none. Lucas shifted slightly. His lips parted as if he wanted to say something, but then he clamped them shut again. His small hands trembled just a little, and he held on to his toy even tighter. "Are you mad?" Lucas finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Ethan exhaled, forcing himself to push through the storm in his mind. He knelt down to Lucas's level, his towering presence suddenly feeling too overwhelming for the small boy in front of him. "No," Ethan said, his voice quieter now. "I'm not mad." Lucas studied him carefully. "Mommy said you were very busy." Ethan swallowed the lump in his throat. "I was." Lucas blinked. "Are you still too busy?" The question hit him harder than it should have. He didn't answer right away. He couldn't. Claire was watching him closely, waiting, hoping. Ethan glanced at Lucas's small, nervous frame, at the way the boy shifted from foot to foot as if bracing for rejection. And in that moment, Ethan knew there was only one answer. "Not anymore," he said. Lucas's grip on his toy car loosened just slightly. He still looked unsure, still cautious, but there was a flicker of something else in his expression now, hope. Claire let out a slow breath of relief. Ethan knew this was just the beginning. He didn't know how to be a father. He didn't know what it meant to raise a child, to be responsible for someone other than himself. But as he looked at Lucas, at the son he had never known, he realized that for the first time in his life, he was about to take on something bigger than any business deal, bigger than any empire he had built. And there was no turning back. Ethan had never been a man who doubted himself. Every decision he made, every risk he took, was calculated with precision. He had built an empire by trusting his instincts and never looking back. But now, as he stood in his own home, staring at the 6-year-old boy who had just learned the truth about his father, Ethan felt something unfamiliar, uncertainty. Lucas had barely spoken since Ethan's quiet admission. He stood close to Claire, his small hands still wrapped around his toy car as if it were the only thing anchoring him in this unfamiliar situation. His blue eyes, so much like Ethan's, flickered with emotions too complex for a child to fully understand. Claire finally broke the silence. "It's late. Lucas needs to rest." Ethan nodded, grateful for the temporary reprieve. "There's a guest room down the hall. I'll have someone bring anything you need." Claire hesitated for a moment, then gave a small nod. "Thank you." Lucas followed his mother as she led him out of the room, but just before disappearing down the hallway, he turned back to glance at Ethan once more. It was brief, hesitant, as if he were trying to decide what to make of this man who was suddenly his father. Ethan watched them go, exhaling slowly. His mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, memories, and questions that had no immediate answers. He turned back toward the living room, walking over to the sleek bar where he poured himself a glass of whiskey. He didn't usually drink this late, but tonight was an exception. The alcohol burned his throat, but it didn't clear his mind the way he had hoped. Instead, his thoughts drifted to Claire. To the way she had looked at him when she told him she was sick. To the way she had said Lucas had no one else. He closed his eyes briefly, pressing his fingers against his temple. This wasn't just about a child in need of a home. This was his son. The weight of that realization settled deep in his chest. He had spent years believing that love, family, and attachments were distractions, liabilities in a world where only the strongest survived. But now, he was being forced to confront something bigger than himself. A quiet sound pulled him from his thoughts. He turned, and there, standing just a few feet away in the dimly lit room, was Lucas. The boy's bare feet barely made a sound against the polished floor as he shifted uncertainly, his small figure dwarfed by the vast space around him. He was clutching his toy car tightly, his grip tense. Ethan set down his glass. "Couldn't sleep?" Lucas shook his head. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was thick, filled with things unsaid. Lucas hesitated before taking a small step forward. Do you live here alone? Ethan wasn't sure why that was the first question the boy asked, but he nodded. Yes. Lucas frowned slightly, as if trying to understand. It's really big. Ethan smirked slightly, though it faded quickly. It's supposed to be. Lucas looked around again, his small fingers tightening around his toy. It feels empty. Ethan wasn't sure why, but that statement hit him harder than he expected. Lucas hesitated before speaking again. Did you want me? The question was soft, hesitant, but it cut deeper than anything Ethan had ever heard before. He inhaled slowly, forcing himself to push past the sharp sting of guilt that suddenly crept up his spine. He knelt down so that he was at eye level with the boy. I didn't know about you, he admitted honestly. If I had, things would have been different. Lucas studied him for a long moment, then glanced down at his toy car, running his thumb over the plastic surface. Mommy said you were important. Too important for things like this. Ethan's jaw tightened. He had spent years chasing success, believing that it was the only thing that mattered. And now, standing here, looking at the son he never knew he had, he wondered how much of his life had been built on the wrong priorities. I was wrong, Ethan said finally. Some things are more important. Lucas looked up at him again, his blue eyes searching. He didn't say anything, but after a few seconds, he nodded as if accepting that answer. Ethan watched as the boy turned slightly, shifting his weight from foot to foot. Can I stay here? The question was so small, so quiet, but it made something inside Ethan tighten. You don't have to ask, Ethan said. This is your home now. Lucas bit his lip, considering that, then gave a small nod. Okay. He didn't say anything else. Instead, he turned and walked back toward the hallway where his mother was sleeping. Ethan watched him go, feeling something inside him shift. For the first time in years, his house didn't feel quite as empty. And for the first time in his life, Ethan Collins knew that no amount of power or wealth could ever compare to what he had just been given, a chance to be a father. The next morning, Ethan woke earlier than usual. He wasn't sure if it was because of the conversation with Lucas the night before or because, for the first time in years, he wasn't alone in his house. Either way, he found himself sitting at the kitchen counter, staring at a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. He had never spent much time in this part of the house. The kitchen was modern, sleek, and barely used. His staff usually prepared his meals, but today, something stopped him from calling them. He didn't know much about kids, but he knew one thing: he couldn't just pretend Lucas wasn't here. The sound of soft footsteps made him turn. Lucas stood in the doorway, his dark brown hair slightly messy from sleep, his blue eyes still groggy. He clutched his toy car in one hand, rubbing his eyes with the other. Morning, Ethan said, surprised by how different his own voice sounded, softer, less controlled. Lucas hesitated before stepping further into the room. Morning. Ethan studied the boy, noticing how small he looked in the vastness of the kitchen. For a moment, neither of them spoke. It was strange, this quiet tension between them, both aware of what had changed but unsure of how to navigate it. Are you hungry? Ethan finally asked. Lucas nodded. Ethan exhaled, standing up. What do you eat for breakfast? Lucas shrugged. Mom usually made pancakes. Pancakes. Ethan frowned slightly. That wasn't something he had ever made before, but how hard could it be? He moved to the cabinets, searching for ingredients. Lucas climbed onto one of the stools at the counter, watching him with curiosity. Do you know how to cook? Ethan smirked. Not really. But I can follow instructions. He found a box of pancake mix and read the instructions. He wasn't used to doing things like this himself, but something about it felt necessary. Lucas rested his chin on his hand. Mom never used instructions. She just knew how to do it. Ethan glanced at him. There was something in the boy's voice, admiration, nostalgia, maybe even sadness. "She sounds like she was good at a lot of things," Ethan said, cracking an egg into a bowl. Lucas nodded. "She was." Silence stretched between them, but this time, it wasn't uncomfortable. Ethan focused on mixing the batter while Lucas watched, occasionally offering advice. When the first pancake sizzled in the pan, Lucas leaned forward slightly, clearly invested in the process. "You're not very good at flipping them," he observed after Ethan fumbled the first attempt. Ethan chuckled. "I'm better at running companies than making pancakes." Lucas smiled a little, and for the first time, Ethan saw something in his expression relax. A few minutes later, he placed a plate of slightly uneven pancakes in front of the boy. "Tell me if they're edible." Lucas took a bite, chewing thoughtfully. Then he nodded. "They're not as good as Mom's." Ethan smirked. "Didn't think they would be." "But," Lucas continued, taking another bite, "they're not bad." Ethan took that as a win. They ate in relative quiet, but it wasn't the same awkward silence from the night before. This time, it felt normal. Almost like something was beginning to settle between them. When Lucas finished, he set his fork down and looked up. "Are you really going to take care of me?" The question caught Ethan off guard. He swallowed his last bite before answering. "Yes." Lucas studied him. "Even when it gets hard?" Ethan exhaled. "Even then." The boy was silent for a long moment, as if trying to decide whether or not to believe him. Then he nodded, as if accepting that answer. "Okay," Lucas said. Ethan wasn't sure why, but that single word felt more important than anything he had ever signed in a boardroom. He had just made the biggest commitment of his life. And for the first time, he wasn't afraid of it. The transition wasn't smooth. Ethan had spent his entire life structuring his days around efficiency and productivity. He had never had to think about anyone else's needs outside of business. Now, there was a 6-year-old in his home, and every moment felt like stepping into unfamiliar territory. Lucas wasn't difficult, but he was quiet, watchful. He didn't ask for much, but Ethan could see how uncertain he was. The boy was still adjusting, still trying to understand what this new life meant for him. The first real challenge came that night. Ethan had been in his office, catching up on emails, when he heard a noise down the hall. A soft creak, then a faint shuffle. He frowned, pushing back from his desk and standing up. When he stepped into the hallway, he saw Lucas standing near his bedroom door, his small fingers gripping the edge of the frame. His teddy bear, one Ethan hadn't even noticed before, was clutched tightly in his other hand. Ethan's frown deepened. "Lucas?" The boy hesitated, shifting slightly. "I had a bad dream." Ethan wasn't sure how to respond. He had never dealt with this before. His instinct was to tell Lucas to go back to bed, that it was just a dream, that everything was fine. But something about the way the boy stood there, his blue eyes uncertain, stopped him. Instead, Ethan took a slow breath. "Do you want to talk about it?" Lucas hesitated, then shook his head. "No." Ethan nodded. "Do you want to go back to bed?" Lucas looked down at his feet, gripping his teddy bear tighter. "Can I stay out here for a little?" Ethan glanced toward the living room, considering. He wasn't used to having someone else in his space, let alone a child. But he couldn't send the kid back to his room, not when he clearly wasn't ready. He nodded toward the couch. "Come on." Lucas followed him quietly, climbing onto the couch while Ethan sat in the chair across from him. The boy curled up with his teddy bear, tucking his feet under himself. Ethan wasn't sure what he was supposed to do. He had no idea how to comfort a child, how to make things feel normal when nothing about this was normal. So he just sat there. Minutes passed in silence. Eventually, Lucas's breathing evened out, and his eyes began to droop. Ethan thought about taking him back to bed, but then the boy shifted slightly, mumbling something in his sleep. Ethan exhaled, leaning back in his chair. He wasn't good at this. He didn't know how to be a father. But as he watched Lucas sleep, something settled in his chest. Maybe he didn't have to know everything right away. Maybe just being here was enough for now. Ethan had never imagined that his life would change so drastically in such a short amount of time. He had always operated on a strict schedule, his days planned down to the last detail. But now, every morning started with something new. Sometimes it was the sound of tiny feet running down the hall, sometimes it was an unexpected question over breakfast, and sometimes it was the realization that he had absolutely no idea what he was doing. Lucas was still adjusting. He wasn't difficult or demanding, but he was cautious, as if still unsure whether this new life with Ethan was something real or just temporary. One morning, as Ethan sat at the kitchen table sipping his coffee, Lucas climbed onto a chair across from him, swinging his legs slightly. The boy had a serious expression, his toy car resting on the table beside him. "I have to go to school, right?" Lucas asked. Ethan glanced up from his laptop. It wasn't a question he had been expecting, but it was an obvious one. He had been so focused on getting Lucas settled that he hadn't even thought about what came next. "Yes," Ethan said. "You'll need to start soon." Lucas nodded slowly, tracing his fingers over the smooth surface of his toy car. "I went to a small school before. I liked it." Ethan leaned back in his chair. "I can find you a good school here." Lucas hesitated, then looked up. "Will you take me?" Ethan wasn't sure why that question hit him the way it did. It was such a simple request, but something about the way Lucas said it made Ethan realize how much it meant to him. "Yes," Ethan said. "I'll take you." Lucas seemed satisfied with that answer. He picked up his toy car and ran it along the edge of the table, his expression thoughtful. "Do you work all the time?" Ethan raised an eyebrow. "What makes you ask that?" Lucas shrugged. "You always have your computer open. Mom used to say you were busy a lot." Ethan exhaled, setting his coffee down. "I was. I still am. But things are different now." Lucas studied him for a moment, then gave a small nod. "Okay." Ethan didn't know what to make of that response, but something about it felt like progress. Later that day, he found himself making calls, arranging for Lucas's school enrollment, speaking with his attorney about the guardianship process, and adjusting his own schedule to make room for something he had never prioritized before, time. That evening, as they sat on the couch watching a movie, Lucas turned to him suddenly. "Are you still learning how to be a dad?" Ethan glanced at him. "Yeah," he admitted. "I think I'll be learning for a long time." Lucas nodded as if that answer made sense. "I think you're doing okay." Ethan smirked. "Just okay." Lucas grinned. "Maybe a little better than okay." Ethan chuckled, shaking his head. It wasn't a perfect answer, but it was honest. And for now, that was enough. The morning of Lucas's first day of school arrived faster than Ethan had expected. He had spent the past week arranging everything, meeting with administrators, making sure all the paperwork was handled, and, most importantly, adjusting his own schedule so that he could take Lucas himself. He wasn't sure why that part had felt so important, but it did. Lucas sat at the breakfast table, quietly eating a bowl of cereal, his blue eyes occasionally flicking up toward Ethan. He had been unusually quiet all morning, his toy car untouched beside his bowl. "You nervous?" Ethan asked, setting his coffee down. Lucas shrugged, poking at his cereal with his spoon. "A little." Ethan leaned forward slightly. "It's okay to be nervous. It's a new school, new people. It'll take time to get used to." Lucas nodded but didn't say anything. Ethan watched him for a moment, then glanced at the clock. "We should get going. Don't want to be late." Lucas slid off his chair, grabbing his backpack and the toy car he never went anywhere without. Ethan had thought about telling him that he might not be able to bring toys to school, but something stopped him. Maybe the car was a comfort, something familiar in the middle of so many changes. The drive was quiet at first. Lucas stared out the window, watching the city move past. Ethan had taken the morning off to do this himself, something that still felt foreign to him. Halfway to the school, Lucas finally spoke. "You won't forget to pick me up, right?" Ethan glanced at him, surprised. "Of course not." Lucas didn't look convinced. Ethan tightened his grip on the wheel. "Has someone forgotten to pick you up before?" Lucas hesitated. "Not really. But sometimes Mom was late when she had doctor stuff." Ethan felt a pang in his chest. Claire had probably done everything she could to make Lucas feel safe, even while she had been fighting her own battle. "I'll be here," Ethan said firmly. "Right on time." Lucas gave a small nod, looking down at his toy car. When they pulled up to the school, kids and parents filled the sidewalks. Ethan parked the car and got out, walking around to Lucas's side. The boy climbed out slowly, gripping his backpack straps tightly. For the first time, he really looked small. Ethan knelt down beside him, lowering himself to Lucas's level. "You'll do great today," he said. "And I'll be right here when school's over." Lucas hesitated, then, to Ethan's surprise, reached out and wrapped his arms around his neck in a quick but tight hug. Ethan froze for a second, caught off guard. Then he slowly placed a hand on Lucas's back, returning the hug just as carefully. Lucas pulled away just as quickly, adjusting his backpack and straightening up. "Okay," he said, as if convincing himself. "I'll see you later." Ethan watched as he turned and walked toward the school entrance, his toy car still in his hand. For the first time in his life, Ethan Collins understood what it meant to be responsible for someone else, not just financially, not just legally, but emotionally. And as he stood there watching his son walk into his future, he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going anywhere. This story is more than just a tale of a wealthy businessman discovering he has a son. It's a journey of redemption, unexpected love, and the realization that true success isn't measured in power or wealth, but in the connections we build. Ethan Collins begins as a man who believes he has everything, until he is faced with the one thing he never planned for: fatherhood. At first, he resists, not because he doesn't care, but because he doesn't know how. He has spent years avoiding attachments, believing they were a weakness. But as he gets to know Lucas, he realizes that love isn't a distraction, it's the only thing that truly matters. Lucas, on the other hand, is a child who has lost his mother and is suddenly thrown into a life with a man he has never met. He is cautious, unsure of where he belongs, but despite everything, he is open to the possibility of trust. His quiet strength is what ultimately changes Ethan, not through force, but through the simple, undeniable truth that he deserves to be loved. The beauty of this story lies in its imperfect journey. Ethan doesn't become a perfect father overnight. Lucas doesn't immediately embrace him. There are moments of doubt, miscommunication, and struggle. But in the end, they choose each other. Not because they have to, but because they want to. The final moments, with Ethan watching Lucas walk into his future, solidify his transformation. He has spent his life believing he was in control of everything, only to realize that the most important decision he ever made was one he never saw coming. This is a story about change. About second chances. About how love, even when unexpected, has the power to reshape a life. And in the end, Ethan doesn't just gain a son, he gains a reason to truly live. Ethan Holden had built his life around control. Every decision calculated, every risk measured, every outcome predicted. But nothing could have prepared him for the moment he pulled a drowning little girl from the pool, only to look into her wide, terrified blue eyes and see his own staring back at him. Ethan Holden had attended more corporate events and exclusive gatherings than he could count. They all blurred together, the same luxury venues, the same perfectly curated guest lists, the same surface-level conversations about stocks, market trends, and investments. Tonight was no different. A private charity gala at an upscale country club, where business moguls and socialites sipped expensive champagne and made carefully veiled deals over gourmet hors d'oeuvres. Ethan was used to it. He thrived in these circles. But as he stood near the pool, casually listening to a partner discuss an upcoming merger, his mind was elsewhere. The evening was warm, and the soft glow of lanterns reflected off the water, giving everything an almost surreal golden hue. The rhythmic chatter of the crowd, the clinking of glasses, the distant hum of a jazz band, it was all background noise. He had learned to tune it out long ago. He was about to excuse himself and step away for a moment of fresh air when something cut through the comfortable monotony of the evening. A sharp, panicked scream. It took him a second to process the sound. Then another second to register where it had come from. His gaze snapped toward the pool just as a splash sent water rippling outward. The people around him turned, some gasping, others frozen in shock. In the deep end of the pool, a small child was struggling. Her tiny hands clawed at the surface, her mouth open in a silent cry, her golden blonde hair fanning out in the water. She couldn't have been more than 6 years old. For a second, no one moved. It was as if the entire gathering had collectively forgotten how to react. A woman let out a strangled cry, but she didn't move forward. Others just stood there, stunned, waiting for someone else to act. Ethan didn't wait. He was already moving. His jacket hit the ground as he rushed forward, and without hesitation, he dove into the pool. The cold water engulfed him instantly, but his body moved on instinct. He pushed forward, reaching the girl just as she slipped under. His arms wrapped around her, pulling her upward as he kicked hard toward the surface. When they broke through the water, she was coughing, gasping, her small fingers gripping his shirt in desperation. "I've got you," he said, his voice firm but calm. "You're okay." He held her securely as he swam toward the edge of the pool. Strong hands reached down, someone finally reacting, and helped lift her out of the water. Ethan followed, hoisting himself onto the deck, water dripping from his clothes as he knelt beside her. The girl was trembling, her breaths coming in short gasps. Her blue eyes, strikingly bright even in the dim evening light, were wide with shock. A second later, a woman pushed through the gathered crowd, her heels clattering against the stone pavement as she rushed toward them. "Emmy! Oh my God, baby!" Ethan barely had time to register the name before the woman dropped to her knees beside the little girl. Her hands shook as she cupped the child's face, brushing wet strands of hair away with frantic, tender movements. The girl, Emmy, blinked up at her, her breathing still uneven. "Mommy," she murmured, her voice small and shaky. "The man saved me." Ethan looked up at the mother, ready to reassure her that Emmy was going to be fine. But the words died in his throat the moment their eyes met. "Cassie." His entire body went still. For a second, he thought he was imagining it, that his mind was playing tricks on him. But there was no mistaking her. Even after 6 years, she looked exactly the same. Dark brown hair that framed her face, deep brown eyes filled with panic and relief, the same expression she used to have when she was trying to hide her emotions but failing miserably. His pulse thundered in his ears as realization hit him like a wrecking ball. Emmy. Cassie's daughter. Cassie's daughter with blonde hair. Cassie's daughter with his blue eyes. His mouth felt dry as he stared at the little girl again, his mind racing so fast he could barely keep up. It wasn't possible. It couldn't be possible. And yet, the resemblance was undeniable. Cassie seemed to realize it at the same time he did. Her entire body tensed, her breath hitching, as though she had just been caught in a lie she had been keeping for years. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. Ethan forced himself to swallow, to push through the storm of emotions crashing over him. He had to be sure. Cassie, his voice was rough, almost unrecognizable to himself. Is she? She shot up to her feet, suddenly on high alert. No, she said too quickly, shaking her head. No. Thank you for helping her, Ethan. I appreciate it. But we have to go. She bent down, scooping Emmy into her arms. The little girl wrapped her arms around her mother's neck, still shaken but no longer crying. Ethan stood, his muscles tense, his mind screaming at him to stop her. He couldn't let her just walk away. Not this time. Not without answers. Wait, he said sharply. Cassie, stop. She hesitated, but only for a second. Then she turned away. Cassie. His voice was louder now, demanding. He took a step forward, his heart pounding. Tell me the truth. Is she my daughter? She froze. The crowd was silent around them, but Ethan barely noticed. He could see it in her posture, in the way her fingers curled protectively around Emmy's back, in the way she refused to look at him. That was all the answer he needed. Cassie took a deep breath, then finally turned her head slightly, just enough to whisper the one word that changed everything. Goodbye, Ethan. And then she walked away. Ethan stood there, his clothes still soaked, water dripping onto the stone pavement beneath him, but he barely noticed. His pulse thundered in his ears as he watched Cassie disappear into the crowd, Emmy still wrapped tightly in her arms. The weight of what had just happened pressed down on him like a crushing force. He had just saved a little girl from drowning, and now, in the span of a few minutes, he had been hit with the impossible realization that she might be his daughter. The logical part of his brain demanded answers. It screamed at him to chase after Cassie, to force her to tell him the truth, to demand why she had kept this from him. But his body refused to move. He was still processing the shock, his mind racing through every possibility, every memory, every moment from 6 years ago that could explain how he had a child he had never known about. He had spent years wondering why Cassie left. One day, she had been there, the woman he thought he was going to marry, the only person who had ever made him think about a future outside of his career. And then, in the blink of an eye, she was gone. No explanations, no fights, no warning, just a short note saying she was sorry and that it was for the best. He had looked for her, tried to understand, but eventually, he had convinced himself that she had simply chosen a different life. Now he knew that wasn't the truth. A hand landed on his shoulder, snapping him out of his thoughts. He turned to see one of his business partners, Ryan, looking at him with concern. Hey, man. You okay? That was intense. Ethan blinked, forcing himself to nod. Yeah. I'm fine. Ryan studied him for a second before lowering his voice. You know her? Ethan exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand down his face. Yeah, he admitted. I do. Ryan raised an eyebrow. And the kid? Ethan's jaw tightened. I don't know, he said, and the weight of those words nearly crushed him. He didn't wait for Ryan's response. He turned and walked away, his mind already forming a plan. He needed to find Cassie. He needed to hear the truth from her own lips. The next morning, Ethan was at his desk, his laptop open in front of him, his fingers tapping against the surface as he waited for a search to load. He had barely slept. The moment he got home the night before, he had started looking for her. He had connections, resources, access to the kind of information most people couldn't get their hands on. It hadn't taken long to track her down. Cassie Brooks. Senior editor at a small publishing house in the city. She had been living in New York for 3 years. 3 years. That meant she had moved here long before their paths had accidentally crossed at the gala. Which also meant she had never intended for him to find out about Emmy. The thought made his stomach twist. He grabbed his phone, staring at the number he had found for her. He could call. He could demand answers right now. But something told him she wouldn't pick up. She had been running from him for years. Why would she stop now? No, he needed to do this in person. Less than an hour later, Ethan was stepping into the quiet, cozy office of the publishing house where Cassie worked. It was a far cry from the corporate skyscrapers he was used to, smaller, more personal, filled with bookshelves and framed quotes about storytelling. It suited her. A receptionist greeted him with a polite smile. "Can I help you?" "I'm here to see Cassie Brooks," he said. "Is she available?" The woman hesitated. "Do you have an appointment?" Ethan forced a polite smile. "It's personal. She'll want to see me." The receptionist still looked unsure, but she nodded and picked up the phone. A moment later, she gestured toward a hallway. "Second office on the left." Ethan thanked her and walked toward the door. He didn't knock. He stepped inside and found Cassie sitting at her desk, a pen in her hand, her brows furrowed as she reviewed a manuscript. She looked up. The moment her eyes met his, he saw the flicker of panic. "Ethan," she breathed, setting down the pen. "What are you doing here?" He closed the door behind him. "We need to talk." Cassie exhaled, already shaking her head. "Ethan, Is she mine?" The words came out sharp, cutting straight through whatever excuse she had been about to make. "Tell me the truth, Cassie. Is Emmy my daughter?" She closed her eyes for a second, as if bracing herself, then looked at him again. He saw the battle in her expression, the part of her that wanted to keep running, and the part of her that knew she couldn't anymore. "Yes," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan felt his breath catch. He had known it. He had seen it in Emmy's eyes. But hearing it out loud was different. It sent a wave of emotions crashing over him, anger, betrayal, shock, something dangerously close to heartbreak. "Why?" His voice was quieter now, but no less intense. "Why did you keep her from me?" Cassie swallowed hard, gripping the edge of her desk. "Because you had your whole life planned out, Ethan. Your career, your ambitions, there was no room for a baby. I knew if I told you, you'd feel obligated to stay, and I couldn't do that to you." His hands clenched into fists. "That wasn't your choice to make." She let out a shaky breath. "I thought I was doing the right thing." "The right thing?" His voice rose slightly. "You took away 4 years, Cassie. 4 years of my daughter's life. Do you have any idea what that feels like?" Tears welled in her eyes. "I do," she whispered. "I've regretted it every day." Ethan stared at her, his heart pounding. He wanted to be furious. He wanted to yell, to demand why she had stolen those years from him. But more than anything, he wanted to know his daughter. "I want to see her," he said, his voice firm. "I want to be in her life." Cassie hesitated. "Ethan, No," he cut her off. "No more running. No more excuses. I lost 4 years. I'm not losing another day." Cassie wiped at her eyes, her expression unreadable. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she gave a small nod. "One day," she said quietly. "We'll start with 1 day." It wasn't enough. But it was a start. Ethan had always been a man who took control of every situation. He built his empire from the ground up by making bold decisions, by never hesitating, by always knowing his next move before anyone else did. But as he stood in front of Cassie's apartment door the next morning, waiting for her to open it, he realized this was the first time in his life that he had no idea what to expect. He had barely slept the night before. Every time he closed his eyes, his mind raced with the same thoughts, the same unanswered questions. What had Emmy's first word been? What had she looked like when she took her first steps? What kind of things made her laugh? He had missed all of it, for years of moments he would never get back, and the weight of that loss settled in his chest like a lead anchor. The door opened, and there she was. Cassie looked tired, as if she hadn't slept much either. She was dressed casually in jeans and a soft sweater, her dark hair pulled into a loose ponytail. There was hesitation in her eyes, but also resignation. She had agreed to this, and now there was no turning back. "She's in the living room," Cassie said softly, stepping aside. Ethan swallowed the lump in his throat and walked in. The apartment was warm and inviting, nothing like the cold, modern spaces he was used to. Bookshelves lined the walls, filled with colorful children's books mixed with Cassie's own collection. A few framed drawings, clearly made by small hands, were taped to the fridge. The scent of something sweet lingered in the air, as if cookies had been baked recently. And then he saw her. Emmy was sitting on the floor, her small legs crossed as she carefully stacked wooden blocks into a tiny castle. Her golden blonde hair fell in soft waves around her face, and her bright blue eyes, his blue eyes, were focused with deep concentration. She hadn't noticed him yet. Ethan felt his breath hitch. She was so small. So delicate. And yet, there was something familiar in the way she furrowed her brow in determination, something that sent a strange mix of warmth and heartbreak through him. Cassie cleared her throat. "Emmy, sweetheart." The little girl looked up, her expression curious. Cassie gave her a gentle smile. "Remember how I told you someone special was coming to visit today?" Emmy's gaze shifted to Ethan. She studied him with an intensity that caught him off guard, as if she was trying to figure out exactly who he was before deciding what to do next. Then, to his utter surprise, she tilted her head and said, "You're the man who saved me." Ethan felt his chest tighten. "Yeah," he said, his voice softer than he expected. "That was me." Emmy blinked, considering this. Then she looked at Cassie. "Mommy said you know us." Ethan forced himself to stay calm, to let Cassie lead the conversation. He knew this wasn't something that could be rushed. "I do," he said carefully. "I've known your mommy for a long time." Emmy stared at him for another moment before nodding, as if deciding that this answer was acceptable. Then, completely unfazed, she patted the floor next to her. "Do you want to help me build?" Ethan hesitated only a second before moving forward and lowering himself to the floor. He was still in his usual dress shirt and slacks, but he didn't care. If his daughter wanted him to build a castle, then that's exactly what he was going to do. "What are we building?" he asked, reaching for a block. "A princess castle," Emmy announced proudly. "But it needs to be really big." Ethan smiled. "Got it. Biggest castle ever." Cassie sat on the couch, watching them, her expression unreadable. Ethan knew this wasn't easy for her. She had spent years raising Emmy alone, protecting her, keeping this world separate from the one he had lived in. Now, in a matter of days, that wall was crumbling. For the next hour, Ethan let Emmy take charge, following her instructions as they carefully stacked blocks into a towering structure. She was full of energy, talking non-stop about her favorite books, her best friend at preschool, the pink bicycle she was hoping to get for her next birthday. He soaked in every word, committing every detail to memory. At one point, she looked up at him with a thoughtful expression. "Do you have kids?" The question caught him off guard. "No," he said carefully. "Just you." Emmy blinked. "Oh," she said simply, as if filing that information away for later. Then she smiled. "That's good. You can help me with my castle more." Ethan chuckled, shaking his head. "Sounds like a deal." After a while, Cassie stood. "Lunch time," she said. "Emmy, go wash your hands." The little girl scrambled to her feet and ran off down the hall. Ethan watched her go, feeling something unfamiliar settle in his chest, something that felt dangerously close to belonging. Cassie exhaled, rubbing her temples. "That went better than I expected." Ethan turned to her. "She's incredible," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Cassie's gaze softened. "She is." He hesitated before speaking again. "Cassie. I need to be in her life. I don't know how yet, but I need to figure it out." Cassie was quiet for a long moment. Then, finally, she nodded. "Okay," she said softly. "We'll take it one step at a time." It wasn't a perfect answer. But for now, it was enough. Ethan had never been good at waiting. He was used to immediate results, to making a decision and watching it unfold exactly the way he planned. That was how he had built his career, how he had climbed to the top while others hesitated. But this, earning a place in his daughter's life, wasn't something that could be rushed. Cassie had made that clear when she told him they would take things one step at a time, and as much as it frustrated him, he knew she was right. Over the next few weeks, he spent as much time with Emmy as Cassie allowed. It started with short visits, an hour at the park, lunch at a small cafe, sitting on the floor of Cassie's apartment helping Emmy put together puzzles. Every time he saw her, he learned something new. She hated peas but loved strawberries. She had a stuffed rabbit named Mr. Hop who had to sleep next to her every night. She liked to dance when she thought no one was watching. She was smart, funny, and stubborn in a way that reminded him so much of himself that it was almost unsettling. One afternoon, they sat together at a small table in a children's play area inside a bookstore. Emmy had a coloring book open in front of her, carefully filling in a picture of a princess while Ethan watched. He had never thought he would be the kind of man to sit in a bookstore with a 4-year-old, handing her different colored crayons while she debated which shade of pink was best, but now he couldn't imagine being anywhere else. "Are you coming again tomorrow?" Emmy asked without looking up. Ethan hesitated, glancing at Cassie, who was sitting on a nearby bench with a cup of coffee in her hands. She had given him space with Emmy, but he could feel her listening. "I don't know, sweetheart," he said carefully. "That's up to your mom." Emmy finally looked at him, her blue eyes serious. "I think you should come." Ethan felt his heart squeeze. "I'd like that too," he admitted. She nodded, apparently satisfied, and went back to coloring. Ethan glanced at Cassie again, and this time she met his eyes. There was something in her expression, hesitation, but also something softer, something that told him she was beginning to trust him. Later that evening, as they stood outside the bookstore, Ethan walked Cassie and Emmy to their car. Emmy was tired, her small hand wrapped around her mother's as she yawned. "Ethan," Cassie said quietly once Emmy was settled in her car seat. He turned to her, waiting. "You should come tomorrow." His chest tightened. It wasn't just an invitation. It was a step forward, a sign that she was finally letting him in. "I'll be there," he promised. As he watched them drive away, he realized that for the first time in a long time, he wasn't thinking about work or deals or deadlines. He was thinking about bedtime stories, about small hands gripping his, about the way Emmy's eyes lit up when she saw him. He was thinking about the future. And this time, it wasn't just his own. Ethan arrived at Cassie's apartment the next afternoon, feeling something unfamiliar, a nervous energy that he wasn't used to. He had closed million-dollar deals without hesitation, faced down corporate sharks without blinking, but standing in front of Cassie's door, waiting for it to open, he felt something he couldn't quite name. Maybe it was because, for the first time in his life, he wasn't in control of the outcome. When the door opened, Cassie stood there, wearing a casual sweater and jeans, her dark brown eyes scanning his face as if trying to gauge whether she had made the right decision in inviting him over. She still wasn't sure about this. He could see it in the way she hesitated before stepping aside to let him in. "She's in her room," Cassie said softly, closing the door behind him. "She's been excited all day." Ethan felt a warmth spread through his chest at the thought. He was still getting used to the idea that someone so small could be waiting for him, that he was becoming an important part of someone's world in a way that had nothing to do with business or success. He followed Cassie down the hall, stopping in the doorway of a room that was unmistakably Emmy's. The walls were a soft pastel pink, decorated with glow-in-the-dark stars and drawings that looked like they had been made by small hands. A bookshelf filled with colorful storybooks stood against the wall, next to a small bed covered in a floral-patterned blanket. And there, sitting cross-legged on the floor, was Emmy. She looked up the moment she saw him, her bright blue eyes lighting up. "You came," she said, scrambling to her feet. Ethan smiled. "Of course I did." Emmy grabbed his hand, tugging him toward a tiny plastic tea set arranged in the middle of the floor. "We're having a tea party," she announced. "You have to sit here." Ethan glanced at Cassie, who was standing by the doorway with her arms crossed, watching them. She didn't say anything, but there was a softness in her expression that hadn't been there before. He lowered himself onto the floor, sitting awkwardly on the small rug as Emmy handed him a tiny pink teacup. "You have to pretend it's real," she instructed, lifting her own cup with exaggerated elegance. Ethan fought back a smile and mimicked her movements. "This is the best tea I've ever had," he said seriously. Emmy giggled. "It's not real, silly." Cassie let out a quiet laugh from where she stood, and for a brief moment, Ethan felt something shift in the air between them. He had spent so long being angry at her for keeping Emmy a secret, but now, watching the way she looked at their daughter, he realized something. She hadn't done it to hurt him. She had done it to protect Emmy, to give her a stable life without the chaos that came with his world. He still wasn't sure if he could ever fully forgive her, but for the first time, he understood. They spent the afternoon playing in Emmy's room. She showed him every stuffed animal she owned, made him color in one of her books, and even insisted on reading him a story, even though she stumbled over some of the bigger words. Ethan listened intently, memorizing every little thing about her. At some point, Emmy climbed onto his lap, settling against him as she flipped through another book. Ethan barely breathed, afraid to move, afraid to break whatever magic was happening. He had spent years believing that he wasn't the kind of man meant for family life, that his world was too fast-paced, too demanding. But right now, sitting on the floor of his daughter's bedroom, with her small hands resting on his arm, he felt something he had never felt before. He felt home. Cassie must have sensed it too, because when she finally spoke, her voice was quieter than before. "She likes you." Ethan looked up at her. "Yeah." Cassie nodded. "She doesn't warm up to people easily. But with you, it's like she's known you forever." Ethan swallowed hard, feeling something tighten in his chest. "I want to be here, Cassie. For her." Cassie held his gaze for a long moment, then let out a slow breath. "I know." For the first time since he had found out about Emmy, she wasn't fighting him. She wasn't trying to push him away. And for the first time, Ethan believed that maybe, just maybe, they had a chance at being something more than just fragments of a broken past. Maybe they had a chance at being a family. Ethan had always thought that success was measured in numbers. The size of his company, the value of his investments, the deals he closed, these were the things that had defined him for years. But now, as he stood in Cassie's kitchen, watching Emmy carefully place stickers onto a sheet of paper with the same level of focus he once reserved for contract negotiations, he realized that success might look completely different than he had imagined. It had been 2 weeks since Cassie had let him into their lives, and in that time, he had come to understand just how much he had missed. He had thought he could step in and make up for lost time, but fatherhood wasn't something that could be built overnight. It was in the small moments, the way Emmy reached for his hand without thinking, the way she called his name excitedly when she saw him, the way she whispered "good night" when he left. Each moment felt like a step forward, a tiny piece of proof that he was slowly becoming part of her world. Tonight, Cassie had invited him over for dinner. It was a simple thing, something that should have felt casual, but to Ethan, it meant everything. Sitting at a dinner table with his daughter, eating a meal that wasn't catered or delivered to his office, was a kind of normalcy he had never imagined for himself. Emmy sat between them, happily chatting about her day at preschool while stabbing at her pasta with a fork that was far too big for her small hands. Cassie listened with a soft smile, occasionally glancing at Ethan as if trying to gauge his reaction to this new version of his life. "She told her teacher today that she has two daddies," Cassie said suddenly, her voice laced with amusement. Ethan raised an eyebrow, looking at Emmy. "Oh yeah?" Emmy nodded, completely unfazed. "I told them I have my daddy, Mr. Hop." Cassie laughed, shaking her head. Mr. Hop is her stuffed rabbit, in case you were wondering. Ethan chuckled, feeling some of the tension in his chest ease. "Good to know I have competition." Emmy tilted her head, considering. "You're bigger than Mr. Hop. And you saved me. So maybe you can be my real daddy, and he can just be my bedtime daddy." The words hit him harder than he expected. He had been waiting for this moment, waiting for her to say it, to acknowledge him as something more than just a visitor in her life. He looked at Cassie, searching for her reaction, but she only watched Emmy with an unreadable expression. "You sure about that, kiddo?" he asked carefully. Emmy nodded. "Yeah. Mr. Hop can't reach the top shelf, but you can. That's important." Ethan swallowed past the lump in his throat. "That is very important." Cassie stood, gathering the empty plates and carrying them to the sink. Ethan instinctively moved to help, but she shook her head. "I've got it. You should put her to bed." Ethan hesitated. "Are you sure?" Cassie nodded, a small smile tugging at the corner of her lips. "I think she'd like that." Ethan turned to Emmy, who was already reaching for his hand. "Come on, Daddy," she said, the word slipping out so naturally that it nearly knocked the air from his lungs. He followed her to her room, taking in the small details he hadn't noticed before. The books lined up perfectly on her shelf, the way her blankets were slightly rumpled from where she had probably jumped on them earlier, the tiny pair of shoes tucked neatly beside her dresser. It was a glimpse into the life he had missed, a reminder of how much he still had to learn. Emmy climbed into bed and grabbed Mr. Hop, hugging him tightly. Ethan sat beside her, unsure of what to do next. "What happens now?" he asked. "You have to tuck me in," Emmy said as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. Ethan carefully pulled the blanket up to her chin, tucking it around her the way he had seen Cassie do. Emmy wiggled a little, getting comfortable, then looked up at him with sleepy blue eyes. "You have to say it," she mumbled. "Say what?" "The thing mommies and daddies say." Ethan felt something tighten in his chest. He leaned down, brushing a stray curl from her forehead, and whispered the words that suddenly meant more to him than anything else in the world. "Good night, sweetheart." Emmy sighed contentedly, her eyes fluttering closed. Within seconds, her breathing evened out, and Ethan sat there for a long moment, just watching her. When he finally stood and walked out of the room, Cassie was waiting for him in the hallway. "She loves you," she said softly. Ethan met her gaze. "I love her too." Cassie exhaled, her expression conflicted. "This isn't just about visits and playtime, Ethan. If you're really in this, it's for good. No walking away. No getting too busy. She doesn't deserve that." Ethan took a step closer, his voice firm. "I don't walk away from the things that matter. And she's the most important thing in my life now." Cassie studied him for a long moment before finally nodding. "Okay," she whispered. Ethan knew there was still a long road ahead. But tonight, as he stood in Cassie's apartment, hearing Emmy's soft breathing from the other room, he realized something. He wasn't just visiting anymore. He was home. Ethan never thought that something as simple as a bedtime routine could change his perspective on life. But every evening he spent with Emmy, reading her stories, tucking her in, and listening to her sleepy little voice ask him questions about his day, felt like another piece of himself falling into place. He had spent years believing that his success was measured by numbers, by business deals, by the expansion of his company. But now, he was starting to realize that true success might be measured in the way Emmy smiled when she saw him, in the way she reached for his hand without thinking, in the quiet, unspoken trust that was growing between them. Cassie had been hesitant at first, careful about how much time she let him spend with Emmy. But after weeks of proving himself, she had started to let down her guard. The visits became longer. Dinners became a routine. Ethan found himself more familiar with the layout of Cassie's apartment than he was with his own penthouse. His life had started shifting in ways he never anticipated, and for the first time, he wasn't resisting it. One evening, after Emmy had fallen asleep, Ethan sat in the living room with Cassie, a cup of coffee in his hands. She was curled up on the couch across from him, looking exhausted but content. He had noticed how hard she worked, how much she carried on her own, and he had started to wonder how she had managed all of it without him for so long. "She really loves having you here," Cassie said, her voice quiet. Ethan looked up from his coffee, meeting her gaze. "I love being here." Cassie hesitated, then sighed, running a hand through her hair. "I never wanted to keep her from you," she admitted. "I told myself I was doing the right thing. That I was protecting her. But the truth is, I was scared. I was scared you wouldn't want this. That you'd feel trapped. That one day, you'd decide this wasn't what you wanted and leave, and I couldn't let her go through that." Ethan set his coffee down, leaning forward. "Cassie, I get why you did what you did. But I need you to hear me when I say that I'm not going anywhere. I missed too much already, and I won't let that happen again." She nodded slowly, but there was still something in her eyes, something unresolved. "I believe you," she said. "But this isn't just about Emmy. It's about us too." Ethan exhaled, running a hand over his face. "I know." Cassie hesitated before continuing. "We were good together once," she said softly. "And then we weren't. I don't know if we can go back to what we were." Ethan studied her, taking in the way she looked at him, cautious, unsure, but not closed off. "I don't want to go back," he said honestly. "I want to move forward. With you. With Emmy. With whatever this is." Cassie looked away, her fingers tightening around the edge of her sweater. "I don't know if I'm ready for that." Ethan nodded, leaning back. "Then we'll take it one step at a time. Just like we're doing with Emmy." Cassie looked at him again, and for the first time, he saw something in her expression that made his heart beat a little faster. Hope. She didn't answer right away, but she didn't dismiss it either. Instead, she gave him a small, almost shy smile. One step at a time. It wasn't everything. But it was a start. And for the first time in years, Ethan felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. Ethan had always believed that happiness was something you had to earn, something that came only after years of work, sacrifice, and relentless ambition. He had spent most of his life chasing it in the form of success, in the endless pursuit of something bigger, something greater. But sitting in Cassie's apartment on a quiet Sunday morning, watching Emmy dance barefoot across the living room in her pajamas, he realized that happiness had been right here all along, in the moments he had never allowed himself to have. The past few months had changed everything. What had started as cautious, carefully scheduled visits had turned into something more natural, something real. He no longer felt like a guest in his daughter's life. He was part of it now, woven into the fabric of her days in a way that felt permanent. She no longer hesitated before reaching for his hand. She no longer looked to Cassie for reassurance when he was around. She trusted him, in the quiet, unconditional way that only children could. This morning, Cassie had made pancakes, and they had sat together at the small kitchen table, Emmy happily swinging her feet as she covered hers in syrup. Ethan had never been a breakfast person, had always rushed through his mornings, too focused on his schedule to care about things like pancakes or syrup-covered fingers. But today, he had let Emmy smear syrup across his plate as she tried to cut his pancakes for him, laughing when she got more on the table than on his fork. He had never known mornings could feel like this. After breakfast, Emmy had decided it was time for a dance party. She turned on music from one of her favorite cartoons and twirled across the room, holding her stuffed rabbit, Mr. Hop, in one hand. Cassie sat beside Ethan on the couch, sipping her coffee, watching their daughter with a soft smile. "She does this every weekend," Cassie said, her voice warm with affection. "She says it's how she starts the day with good energy." Ethan chuckled. "That's a solid strategy." Emmy suddenly stopped mid-spin and turned to face them. "You have to dance too." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Oh, do I?" Emmy nodded, hands on her hips, completely serious. "Yes. Mommy too. Family dance party." Ethan glanced at Cassie, who sighed dramatically before setting down her coffee. "Well, if it's a requirement." She stood, holding out a hand to Ethan. For a second, he hesitated, caught off guard by the gesture. It was such a small thing, but it felt like more. Slowly, he reached out, taking her hand as she pulled him to his feet. Emmy cheered, clapping her hands before grabbing each of them and spinning them in circles. Ethan wasn't sure when was the last time he had danced, let alone in the middle of a living room with a 4-year-old leading the way, but he found that he didn't care. Cassie was laughing, Emmy was beaming, and for the first time in his life, Ethan wasn't thinking about work or the future or what came next. He was just here, in this moment, with them. When the song ended, Emmy collapsed onto the couch in a fit of giggles, and Cassie fell beside her, breathless from laughter. Ethan sat down next to them, feeling something settle inside him, something he hadn't even realized was still restless. Emmy climbed onto his lap, resting her head against his chest. "That was the best dance party ever," she mumbled sleepily. Ethan smiled, wrapping an arm around her small frame. "Yeah, I think so too." Cassie watched them, something unreadable in her expression. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Then, softly, Cassie said, "I think we're going to be okay." Ethan looked at her, his heart tightening in his chest. He had spent so much time wondering if he would ever get to this moment, if he would ever be more than just a visitor in their lives. And now, sitting here with Emmy curled against him and Cassie looking at him like maybe, just maybe, she was ready to believe in him again, he knew the answer. They already were. The ending of this story is more than just a resolution, it's a transformation. Ethan starts as a man who believes success is measured by power and wealth, but by the time the story ends, he realizes that true success is about love, connection, and the moments that can't be bought or planned. His journey isn't just about discovering he has a daughter, it's about proving he's worthy of being in her life, of making up for lost time, and of rebuilding trust with Cassie. What makes this ending satisfying is that it doesn't rely on grand gestures or dramatic declarations. Instead, it finds its power in the small, everyday moments, the family breakfast, the dance party, the quiet acknowledgement between two people who once lost each other but found their way back. Cassie's final words, "I think we're going to be okay," carry so much weight because they're not just about her and Ethan. They're about the family they've become, the second chances they've embraced, and the life they're finally building together. This story isn't just about romance or fatherhood, it's about redemption. It's about a man learning that being present matters more than being perfect. It's about a mother letting go of fear and a little girl who unknowingly heals the wounds of the past simply by existing. And in the end, it's about love, not the kind that's rushed or forced, but the kind that grows, step by step, until it becomes unshakable.